And thank you. Our speaker today is Peter Blaikie. Peter Blaikie is a retired lawyer and businessman. He was one of the founders of Heenan Blaikie. He says, "I was present at the creation, but not at the death of the firm." For 5 years, he was president of Unican Security Systems, a highly successful Montreal manufacturing company. Mr. Blaikie was president of the Progressive Conservative Party during the leadership of Joe Clark. He's been a frequent commentator and columnist on television, radio, and in print. He appeared in several theatrical productions for the Centaur Theatre and over the years has been active in different sports. Mr. Blaikie is the husband of Maya, the father of 4, and has 7 grandchildren, and he's very proud of all of them. So his title today is "The USA is a Remarkable Country," and the screen and the floor is yours, Peter. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is a new experience for me. I've certainly never done something like this on Zoom. And I want to start by saying that it's probably 70 years ago to the day that I first spoke at a Rotary Club meeting in my hometown of Shawinigan. So I feel this is a little bit like Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man. This is quite a number of decades later. I think I should explain the backstory to the title I chose, "The United States is a Remarkable Country." Some years ago, in fact, quite a few years ago, but in our lifetimes, Stephen Wyszynski wrote a book called "In Praise of Older Women." He was a great fan of Dean Frank Scott, poet, dean of the law school, and one of the founders of what's now the NDP. And Wyszynski desperately wanted Frank Scott to write one of those blurbs for the publisher. He finally caught up to Frank Scott, who agreed, perhaps having had 1 drink more than usual. In any event, he then read the book and he thought it was the most appalling stuff. So he thought, what can I possibly say about this book? And he came up with, "This is a most remarkable book." And so the title is, "This is a Remarkable Country, but both in the good and the less good." And I want to talk a little bit today about both. Let's start by what I would consider to be positives. And I should say that after a year and a half of COVID, this is a fairly data-oriented speech, if you like. The other one I mentioned is much more, call it academic. I think the first thing one has to say about the United States in terms of its remarkableness is that it is by far the most powerful military country in the world. The US spends about $750 billion a year on its military. That's as much as the next 10 countries combined. It's 4 times what China spends. It's about 10 times what Russia spends. And the US has about 750 military bases all around the world. Many of them are tiny, for instance, in a lot of African countries. Many of them are huge. I mean, they have, for instance, 40,000 troops in Japan, 35,000 in Germany, and about 25,000 in South Korea. Abraham Lincoln first said about, I guess it's about 200 years ago, not quite. In any event, he said, and I'm just going to read it, "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." In fact, there is certainly no military threat to the United States from anywhere else in the world. And to put the figure of $750 billion in perspective, Biden's original Build Back Better plan, he talked about a figure of $3.5 billion over 10 years. So you're looking at military expenditure of about $750 billion. And for all those other things, they were talking about $350 billion a year. The second thing that I think is important in terms of the positives about the United States, it continues to be certainly the world's most powerful economy. Its GDP is about $20 trillion a year. China's about 15 trillion. And then you get down to Japan and Germany, which are in the range of $5 trillion a year. Interestingly enough, although the pandemic began in China, the Chinese economies actually weathered the pandemic better than the US. In terms of per capita income, the United States is at about $66,000, but that makes it only fifth amongst the OECD countries. And it's interesting, it's well behind some of those notoriously socialist countries. I'll use the word socialist later for a specific purpose, including Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, and Iceland. The US has about 750 billionaires, but interestingly enough, again, in terms of per capita income, it's about 13th in terms of the number of billionaires per population. The US is clearly a world leader in terms of innovation, especially in the areas of high tech. It's got 8 out of 10 of the world's largest companies, and I hope you all own them: Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, and so on. It's got 5 of the 10 largest companies in the world by sales. Interestingly enough, Tesla, which is among the 10 by market capitalization, is not even in the top 50 in terms of sales. And whether one considers universities, medical research, artificial intelligence, orchestras, museums, popular culture, or a host of other things, the United States is clearly in the front rank. In fact, I've always said, if you look at 1% of almost anything, the US is almost always at the top. When you look further down, it's not quite the same story, which leads me to the second aspect of my comments today, which is where I call, and this I admit is exaggerated and basically sarcastic, that it's the 3Ds: dystopian, deranged, and dysfunctional in many respects. And I want to talk about some of those briefly. When we think of dystopian, we tend to think of things like Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984. But in fact, there's another definition. The Cambridge Dictionary says a bad or unfair society in which there is a lot of suffering. The richest country of the world has something like 40 million people who live below their poverty line, which in itself I find an appalling statistics. And more importantly, perhaps, of all the major industrial countries of the world, the US is by far the most unequal. In fact, I think one could argue that at the heart of almost all its current difficulties is that level of inequality. And I want to mention briefly something called the Genie Coefficient, which is designed to measure inequality. It was developed by an Italian economist. I don't even know how it works, but what I do know is that perfect equality is a score of 100, perfect inequality is a score of 0. And the US is at about 41. It ranks 34th out of 40 countries. Again, I find that an appalling comment to think that the world's richest country, in terms of its inequality, ranks 34th. In fact, recently some statistics came out which indicate that about 90% of the wealth in the United States is owned by 10% of the population. The United States is more unequal than every country in Western Europe. And inequality grew during the pandemic. I hope all of you saw your investments rise, as I confess, I shouldn't say I confess, I'm glad to say mine did. But the billionaires in the United States saw their net worth increase by about 50%, which again is quite a staggering figure. And the thing about inequality is that it's not just financial, it's social and cultural, and it tends to be self-perpetuating. The upper income people, their children get better educations, they go to better universities, they meet other people in the same kind of general levels of society, they tend to intermarry, and particularly given the laws in the United States, it in fact tends to be self-perpetuating. Second thing is education. The universities are probably the best in the world, certainly amongst the best in the world. But their education system as a whole, particularly at the high school level, is far from the best. The OECD, with which I'm sure you're all familiar, carries out what they call the PISA tests every 4 years. It's the Program for International Assessment of Students. And they test 15-year-olds in reading, in science, and in mathematics. And I'm just prepared a little graph. Canada does quite well. We could do a lot better, but here are the figures. Out of 60 countries, Canada ranked 6th, the United States 13th. In science, Canada's 9th, the United States is 19th. In mathematics, Canada is 12th, and the United States is 38th.
Wow.
So here you have this extraordinarily disconnected situation between the quality of the best universities, which can only, in fact, cover perhaps 1% of the college students, and a primary education system, which is not even comparable to anything either in Asia or in Europe. In fact, at the top of the PISA results are Asian countries. China's there, Singapore is there, Hong Kong is there, and other countries in Asia. And the European countries are all well ahead of the United States in terms of the PISA rankings. Even within the United States, there are enormous variation. The state of Massachusetts, not surprisingly, with all its universities, ranks first, but the states in the center, the states in the south, which, again, as I'm sure you all know, tend to be the red states as opposed to the blue states, they're well behind the others. And again, and it's part of this inequality to which I referred, the gaps in the PISA results, which aren't perfect by any means, but they are reflective. The gaps are enormous when they're measured by income, by race, and by gender. And as always tends to be the case, people of color or the Latinos tend to be at the bottom of those scales, which makes inequality that much more difficult to overcome. This is a surprising fact. Historically, the rags to riches story, the Horatio Alger stories, the American dream, all indicated a huge degree of social mobility, where people would climb from the lower levels, from economic perspective, to the highest. That is now not over, it'll never be over, but much diminished. And in terms of social mobility, in fact, the United States ranks well behind even the United Kingdom, which we tend to think of as a very class-oriented society. In fact, the World Economic Forum, that's the group that puts on the big show in Davos every year, they did a study which ranked the United States 47th out of the 40 countries studied. 27, sorry, not 47, 27. Now, Joe Biden's Build Back Better Act, whatever you happen to think of the performance of the current government, it's designed to reduce some of these terrible inequalities. There have been a lot of socioeconomic studies which have indicated that one of the best things as a predictor of people's lives, their success, their happiness, is pre-kindergarten education. Another OECD study ranks the United States 28th out of 38. And to the extent that there is pre-kindergarten education in the United States, it is privately financed. I mean, I have a daughter who lives in San Francisco. She and her husband are struggling artists, and they scrape the barrel with a little help from their parents to send their children, as they did, to pre-kindergarten education. The results, by comparison with the schools generally, was quite staggering. Parental leave, which is designed obviously for the bonding process between parents and children. Again, the United States ranked dead last out of 41 countries studied by the OECD. So it's not surprising that one reads increasingly about teenagers and young adults in the United States and questions of the opioid crisis, questions of depression, suicides, which have been rising quite dramatically during COVID. And again, it's a lot of sociological studies take that back to the whole question of parental leave. And in terms of childcare, again, the OECD countries, which are essentially the Western European countries, the government contribution to childcare averages about $14,000 a year. In the United States, it's $500 a year on average. In other words, all these things which are going to determine to a large extent how children are going to prosper either at university or in some other field of their choice are to a large extent determined by the time they're 10 years old. And a lot of it is going to be determined by these various programs where the United States is essentially not present. Now, we know the United States has always been a free market country. It's always been a high capitalist country. But it is interesting that, as I said earlier, those traditionally viewed as socialist countries like the Scandinavian countries, they actually have more people who have become rich on a per capita basis than the United States. And they are thriving market economy. They're not really socialist countries. They have social welfare programs. They have a powerful social welfare net, but they're not socialist countries. I'd like to speak for a moment about healthcare in the United States, because it's always a big subject, and it's a subject always of discussion in Canada. And I have some thoughts on the Canadian situation, which we may discuss later on. How am I doing for time? First of all, the US spends about $11,000 per person, per capita, on healthcare. In Quebec, we spend about $6,900. The average across the OECD is about $6,000. In other words, the US spends about double per person on healthcare. Interestingly enough, in the Western European countries and in Canada, our healthcare spending is about 11% of the gross national product. In the United States, the total is roughly double. It's almost 18%. But what's interesting, and you hear this all the time, and I know the Rotary Club doesn't get into politics, and I'm not going to be partisan particularly, but constantly the refrain from the Republicans is the Democrats are trying to impose socialism. And it's interesting that that goes back almost 100 years. The first time the Republican Party accused the Democrats of socialism and being socialists was in the days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 30s and 40s of the last century. It's clearly nonsense. If they were socialists 100 years ago and have been labeled as socialists ever since, how come the United States is such a thriving capitalist economy with a hugely thriving stock market and all these wonderful, powerful companies? So what's really interesting on the socialism aspect of it is that there are two programs in the United States, Medicare and Medicaid. Those programs spend about half of total US spending on healthcare. In other words, on Medicare and Medicaid alone, the US government spends about the same amount as Canada and all the countries of Western Europe. Now, it's probably true that at the very best, the United States healthcare system is unmatched. It's also true that it's well ahead of the rest of the world in terms of medical research. Witness the COVID vaccines, which were developed so quickly. But that kind of healthcare is for the rich or for Rolls-Royce insurance plans. It's certainly not across the board. And the OECD ranks the United States the worst of 11 rich countries which they studied in terms of medical outcomes, in terms of obesity, in terms of diabetes, in terms of heart problems. And in fact, in the last 2 or 3 years, the life expectancy in the United States has dropped by almost 3 years for men and slightly less for women, but it's been dropping, whereas in most other countries, life expectancy, in fact, has been improving. In the US, on average, a family of 4 would spend about $1,200 a month on its insurance program. My daughter, with 2 children, they literally spend $2,000 a month on health insurance. Now, they have an excellent plan. And to put it in perspective, my 7-year-old grandson recently had an appendectomy, which is no fun for a 7-year-old. The hospital bill was $25,000. So those of us who are inclined to complain about our healthcare system, we have a lot to be grateful for. Getting into the system is sometimes difficult, but I think universally, people in Canada will be inclined to say, once you're in the system, it's pretty damn good. In the US, the drug companies spend about $300 million a year lobbying Congress. It's not surprising that you're seeing on TV, in the context of the attempt to lower prescription drug prices, advertisement after advertisement by the drug companies, in fact, opposing that. And so as a crowning irony, the amazing thing to me is that by 83% to 71% in the other 11 countries studied, the US think their healthcare system is fantastic. They think it's better by 83%. Now, treat that as you will. I would treat it as a monumental level of ignorance about the factual data rather than ascribe it to something else. Finally, and I'll do this fairly quickly because I hope there will be some discussion, an area where I consider that the US is really deranged is in the area of guns. Some of you have probably been watching the 2 trials which are currently proceeding, the one in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the one in Georgia. And in both cases, the defense is using the argument of self-defense. I have no idea what the outcomes will be, but I must admit, as a lawyer who never actually practiced criminal law, I watch these trials and I say, if they manage to get these defendants acquitted, it'll be, at least in my view, a very peculiar result indeed. But who knows what will happen. In any event, as we all know, guns are absolutely not the holy grail necessarily, but incredibly important in the United States. And the strange thing is, almost nobody knows what the Second Amendment, the Guns Amendment, actually says. Everybody knows the last few words. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But I'm sure everybody here knows that there's a first part, which reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people. Everybody's, the courts included, and certainly politicians, neglect the first part of that phrase, which is not even a sentence. In other words, you can only read them together. So what was intended at the time? Again, I don't pretend any expertise, but I've done a fair amount of reading on the subject. And what comes out is that the founders were really thinking of 2 and possibly 3 things. First of all, they did not want a standing professional army such as existed in Europe, where at that stage we're just around the period of the French Revolution and Napoleon, the European states had large professional armies on a permanent basis. They didn't want that. The second thing is that they were concerned, basically, 20 years or so after the revolution, that in fact, there would be an invasion from the United Kingdom. And the fear was not so far-fetched. Think the War of 1812, when much of Washington was actually burned to the ground. I mean, by and large, the US Constitution is a states' rights constitution. Contrary to ours, if you actually read the text, what's happened in practice is quite different. But In fact, states were concerned about an powerful central government. And so the Second Amendment had nothing to do with the notion of people out in the streets, last corral in Dodge City type of thing. There are about 400 million firearms. That's about 120 firearms for every 100 people. 46% of the homes have firearms. And while 60% of Americans say they need guns for personal protection, there are some 25,000 gun suicides in the United States every year, and about another 15,000 homicides. Countries such as Britain, Australia, which reduced dramatically your right to own a weapon, have far, far lower rates of homicide. They have some knife murders, but guns clearly are a very important factor in what I think is dystopian in the United States. And the strange thing is that the population at large favors, by wide margins across the board, more amongst Democrats than Republicans, but favors stricter gun controls. So this year, and I'm going to finish on this and open it up, this year alone, there have been 600 mass shootings in the US. And a mass shooting is defined as a shooting in which 4 people are either killed or injured. So the shooting in Kenosha, I guess one could say, was not a mass shooting, although in my mind, it certainly was. And on that note, I thank you for your attention, and I'm prepared to open it up. Let me just say quite briefly, the other speech which I had prepared, or other text, was basically on the subject of democracy under threat, with reference to the US, but not exclusively. So if somebody wants to ask a question or make a comment or discuss that, I'm open. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We've got Rod with a question. Rod, go ahead.
Right at the beginning, Peter, when you were discussing the military and the strength of the US, that they would not be defeated from external sources, but only internal. And I guess history has showed us that virtually every empire has imploded from inside, whether it's the Roman Empire or the British Empire. How likely do you think it is that that will happen in the United States?
Well, there have been other very dangerous moments in American history, of course, starting with the Civil War. I would say it is highly unlikely that at the end of the day, the United States will implode, but the period that we are living through and the period that we may live through if Donald Trump becomes president again in 2024, probably takes us as close as possible to the threat of a true weakening of democracy in the United States. In other words, there are a lot of writers, a lot of commentators, people who are experts in their fields, not people like me who are just curious and interested, who think that democracy is certainly under threat in the US, and who also believe that in terms of external threats to the continental United States, I mean, it may well be that 50 years from now or 100 years from now, there will be a real threat from China, which I think is the only conceivable threat in terms of something that attacks the US. So I think Lincoln had it right. And if I were an American, I would be very concerned about the state of my democracy. I don't know if that answers your question, but
absolutely,
that's my sense of it. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, but that's the bottom line.
Thank you, Peter. Jim Ferris, you have a question?
Historically, in most any area, socially or whatever, Canada has generally been about 10 years behind the United States. If something happens in the United States, if there's a trend in the United States, this kind of stuff tends to filter its way up. We're as the senior Trudeau said, we are a mouse sitting there sleeping with an elephant. What are in your mind, Peter, what are the effects that this kind of undertaking or events in the United States are going to filter up towards Canada? We have seen some populist rising and so on and so forth up here. But generally, when the United States sneezes, like they say, we catch the cold. What does this bode for us?
Interesting that you should ask, because in my other approach, I begin by saying almost exactly what you said, which is that we tend to be 10 years behind in these things. And so I had a look in terms of Canada, because one of our qualities tends to be occasional complacency, particularly opposite the United States. So I thought to myself, all right, what are some of the issues relating to this question of imploding or democratic rights? What's the status in Canada? And my notes indicate the following things. Obviously, in the 2021 federal election, COVID had some effect on the participation rate, but it fell to about 62%. And generally, we're in the mid-60s. Now, that in itself, to me, is a serious indication and a very negative indication of our commitment to maintaining democracy as best we can. Interestingly enough, and secondly, and I think this is very important, the theory of the British parliamentary system, and everybody in this age group knows that, is that you elect your member of parliament. In other words, the theory is that you don't choose the prime minister. Ever since the era of television and social media, we tend, whether we admit it to ourselves or not, the tendency is that people go to the booth, often without knowing who their local candidates are, and they're determining who they want as prime minister of the country. Now, a riding like Westmount would have been different simply because Mark Garneau, highly respected and well-known, and had been there many years. But there have been any number of academic studies done which indicate that the local candidate probably doesn't account for more than about 10% of the vote. And let me say that I speak with some experience, because I ran twice back in the Middle Ages. And in terms of the norms, was hugely successful, although I lost. But at that time, there were 75 conservative candidates, 73 lost their deposits. And the reason was people decided, and I'm not saying they made a mistake, they wanted Pierre Trudeau rather than Joe Clark. The geographical tensions, which are always present in the country, are rearing their head, and you were referring to that. Clearly, there are a lot of people in Alberta, even Saskatchewan is talking about autonomy and greater autonomy. That tension is probably lower in Quebec today, interestingly enough, than it is in other parts of the country, but it's always a possibility. The real danger, I think, to our democracy, as we've known it historically, is the growth of the Prime Minister's office. And there's nothing original about that. Scholars have written about it as well. But the budget of the Prime Minister's office, and they're always referred to as the boys in short pants, no girls, I guess, but only boys in short pants, is about $10 million a year. Now, obviously, there are other costs, but if one does a simple division at an average salary of $100,000, which is probably high, that's over 100 people. And I've heard figures that are closer to 200. But whether it's 100, whether it's 200, the Prime Minister's office basically runs this country. And well, you may remember, in fact, everybody will, Pierre Trudeau's famous comment that when they're 50 yards away from Parliament, MPs are nobodies. If that was true then, how much more is it true today? And in fact, the average member of Parliament has zero authority, zero influence. By and large, cabinet ministers, I mean, they don't literally line up at the office of the PMO for their instructions every morning, but theoretically, that's what happens. The PMO writes their speeches. The PMO writes their answers to questions that may come up in question period. The fact is that They're not all male, but they are essentially eunuchs today in the way in which the parliamentary system was designed to operate. And so I would say that, again, we're not nearly as far along the road as the United States in terms of democratic difficulties. And that's always been true. I mean, there have always been tendencies to autocracy in the United States, which we really have not had in Canada. But we should be far from being complacent. We should be very careful about our own democracy.
Thank you, Peter. Humam, you have a question or a comment? Okay, Humam, you just have to unmute. There you go, and ask your.
It's a question. How would the world will look like without United States?
Obviously, the world would be a very difficult and different place. Obviously, the United States remains, for all of us in the West, the most important country in the world. We all need the United States to succeed. We cannot afford to have a United States which does not succeed. There's no.
And would you?
But
And what do you think? Would you think that democracy will still working in the future of high-tech future?
it's interesting. I suspect a lot of people 50 years after the atom bomb was developed thought, my God, what a mistake that was. It may well be that 30 years from now, people ask themselves the same question about the internet, social media, and high tech. I am a complete high-tech dinosaur, as I admitted to Susan yesterday, or to somebody in any event, happens to be true. There's no question that the existence and the way we use high tech today and social media are hugely dangerous to democracy, because people write the wildest things and it seems to just go from worse to worse to worse. Now, one has to hope that after all these things are around for 20 or 30 or 40 years, that we will have adapted, we will have learned how to use them and get the benefits. I mean, people said the same thing about television or radio 50 and 30 years ago. But I think those things are going to make everything more difficult for us to maintain our democracies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Merle Binmore has a question and I'll read it out for her. How close is Canada to having an autocratic government to our south if the past president is reelected? The past president is reelected.
If the past president is reelected, I think things in the United States will deteriorate dramatically. Now, it may end up being a wake-up call so that by the time you get to 2028, people will have begun to think more seriously about the state of their country. But if we keep in mind that Trump in 2024, if he's reelected, will not have to think again about being reelected. There are no guardrails which would continue to operate. There will be a Supreme Court which probably will still be 6-3. You'll have an increasing number of states doing the kinds of things that Texas has been doing already with respect to abortion rights, with respect to gun laws. I mean, you can now in Texas and some other states, without training, without a permit, just wander around the streets with a concealed weapon. So there's no question that that is the terrifying thought. Another 4 years of Trump with essentially no guardrails. Because next time around, any appointments, and as you may or may not know, the president appoints about 2,000 people, roughly 1,000 of whom need Senate confirmation. He will appoint people whose loyalty is not to the office of the president, but loyalty to Donald Trump, period. And what you'll have on the other side, obviously, is complete obstructionism. But if Trump wins in 2024, he will probably win the presidency, the House, and the Senate. And frankly, that's a very scary thought.
Sobering.
Yes, very.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Yes,
I
Ken
agree.
McDonald,
Ken McDonald, and then we'll go to Rod. Go ahead, Ken.
sorry. Peter, do you think that the people that are voting for Trump are on the lower end of the scale? In other words, the hoi polloi, or is it people in upper echelons? I mean, is this the people's way of showing their displeasure with the system?
I think to a large extent, it's a combination. It's interesting. There's a book I read recently by a fellow called George Packer, and he, beginning by acknowledging the polarization, the deep divisions, all those things, he essentially creates what he thinks of as 4 categories. First of all, he's got what he calls free America, which would be entrepreneurs, high-tech, investment bankers, libertarians. A lot of those people will certainly vote Trump. His second group is what he calls smart America, and that is generally professionals, doctors, lawyers, business executives, but people at the upper end of the income scale, and that he calls smart America. The third category is what he calls real America, and you need only think of Sarah Palin, or think of the NASCAR Stockmar races, or think of tailgating at college football. I mean, that's real America. And then he calls them unjust or just America, which is people who are involved in things like climate change and Black Lives Matter. So basically, I would say that the Republican vote comes to a large extent at the top of the spectrum, where, for instance, the billionaires get the tax cuts, and then it comes from what's referred to as real America. There was a book by a fellow called J.D. Vance called Hillbilly Elegy, and he was writing about essentially the Appalachians and Ohio and places like that. All those red states are certainly, generally speaking, at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And they are people who clearly Trump appealed to because they feel dispossessed, they feel whiteness is under attack, and so on. So basically, I think you and I are seeing it, if I understood you correctly, in pretty much the same light. That's not all the Trump voters, but the vast majority. I mean, the country divides basically. We've got the 2 coasts, which are blue, the center, which is red. You've got the big cities, which are blue, the rural areas, which are red. And you have that in terms of the income scale or educational scale. I mean, by and large, Trump is appealing, his biggest base is white, non-college graduates. In other words, people in the manufacturing heart of America who have, in fact, in many respects, been dispossessed in the last 20 years.
Thank you, Peter. So we'll call on Rod, and then we'll have just one more question afterwards because I'm mindful of time. And if I don't do that, we're going to have Peter here all afternoon. So Rod, go ahead, please.
Oh, just quickly back to the power of the PMO. I mean, under normal circumstances, when there's a majority government in Canada, the Prime Minister is far more powerful than the President of the United States, where there are some checks and balances. What you're saying, and we're afraid of, is that if Trump gets in 24, that the House and Congress will all be Trumpists, and there may be no checks and balances left in the United States, in which case he would be more powerful than any Prime Minister of Canada.
Of course.
I mean, what you say is certainly interesting. Let's deal with the first part of it. You're absolutely right. And people don't often think about that specifically, that in the British parliamentary system, a prime minister who has a majority government is virtually unlimited in bringing about what he or she wants to achieve. They don't have the power of a US president in terms of they don't have a great big red button that goes to nuclear weapons. But if one measures power in terms of one's ability to achieve what you want to achieve, your agenda, there's no question a British parliamentary system prime minister has far more power. Witness poor old Joe Biden. I mean, not only has he got obstruction from the Republicans, he's got 2 or 3 people in his own party that he can't bring along with him. So there's no question. Now, if you have a Trump as president and Republican House and Senate, then there will be essentially no checks and balances, and there won't be any from the Supreme Court either. So then that power becomes virtually unlimited and dangerous.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So the last question comes from Merle. Is the low level of education in the States responsible for Trumpers except the top tier that you are speaking about?
I would say it certainly seems to correlate. Now, is it causality? That would be a big step. I mean, my view on these things is often tempered by people I deal with in the country. My country property. They don't all have dogs. Many of them, in great many ways, are so much smarter than I am. So one has to make the distinction between intelligence and education. Certainly the Trump voters, generally speaking, tend to be less educated. That doesn't necessarily make them less intelligent. I've known a lot of pretty dumb lawyers. I've known a lot of not very bright investment bankers and a lot of brilliant ones. But there tends to be at least a correlation. And certainly the interesting thing there is sort of counterfoil to that is the fact that in the education scheme of things, it tends to be people of color, the Blacks and the Latinos and other minority groups who tend to suffer from the worst public education. It's just a matter of money. They tend to vote Democrat. And that goes back all the way to FDR and generations ever since. But as a broad correlation, I think what you said was correct. I'm not sure who said it. I think it was Susan.
It was Merle. Susan asked a question for her.
Where is Merle? I don't see Merle on the screen.
No, Merle shows up as a phone number. She doesn't have a visual. So this is our time to wrap it up. Peter, this has been absolutely fascinating. Your rich and varied personal and professional experience gives you a unique and fascinating perspective. And you've gone and done it now because I think we're going to have to invite you back.
Mhm.
So, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us.
I'd be happy to come back.
Okay, then. Everybody heard that.